because there's the economic crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's debate, as a proposition, we stand by the motion that this House would heavily ease labour regulations in times of economic crisis. In the first speech of side proposition, I would like to tell you what the definitions are. So the definition of the economic crisis, of how heavily it would be eased, and also how, so the model of our side. Then I would like to tell you about our arguments that of course will be brought in by my partner, and also about real-life examples showing that our case will actually work better. So first, the economic crisis. It is a situation where there are shortages, where there is inflation, where there are bigger prices of uses and of products, where there's unemployment, and where there's also the smaller value of a currency, for example, a currency of a foreign country comparing to a currency that is more general along the whole world. So in the economic crisis, our House would heavily, for example, long-term or for example, the majority of companies would implement it. It would ease the labor regulations because that is the way that we would find a solution to the economic crisis. So ladies and gentlemen, our model is that we would, for example, focus on reducing or removing the minimum wage and by relaxing safety laws. So how would it exactly work? First, the reduction or the removal of the minimum wage. So it will be done, of course, step by step, and the wages would be somehow lowered or more similar so that the people still have their jobs. Because that is what we want to focus on, ladies and gentlemen, that the people still have a job to go to, still have a meaning, still have a purpose, still have a way of income. That is the most important factor here, because this is something that we will tie back later in one of our arguments, and we will show you the aspect of the society that when the people don't have jobs, they are not happy, and that discontent may lead to serious consequences. The second aspect of our model is relaxing safety laws. It will be done probably by a new policy and will be implemented by government. It would mean that there is at least still a compensation for medical injuries, and that is also an important factor for the content of the society. So now our arguments. The first argument is about the reduction to improvement. This can be shown by a real-life example, as many of our arguments in this debate. So eventually, by reducing those labor regulations, by easing them, we would improve the economic situation. It was actually done once in history. In the 20th century, in the 20th century Russia, Vladimir Lenin introduced a new economic policy. It was the policy that turned away from socialists and went more into capitalism. Although he was criticized for it because that was not the ideals of 20th century Russia, he improved the economic situation in that country. Thanks to it, the content of the society grew, which we know previously was pretty bad. The second argument is about working to stability. As I said before, the minimum wage is reduced, but people still keep their jobs. And that is very important. As we know by history, if the people of a country are unhappy, they will protest, they will strike, they will rise up against the government, and that has never led to a good place. Which is why the people need to have stability, they need to have their jobs, they need to have a purpose, a way of living, and a stable income to raise their families and to live a proper life. The third argument is tying back to what I have said before. It's about the discontent of the society. If there's huge unemployment, if there's inflation, if there are shortages, the people will rise. Also, getting back to the example of Russia, in the early 20th century, there were riots, there were protests, there were the revolutions because of the shortages. This is why the new economic policy was implemented after all. It was about improving the economic situation so that the people wouldn't rise again. And in fact, it worked, which is a real-life example of how the solution of said proposition will work. But also, my teammate will later introduce you the policy, for example, of Ronald Reagan and the Wall Street crash, the first one and the second one, because in the early 20th century, the Wall Street crash was a huge impact on the economy, and yet they found a way to improve the situation by changing regulations, which helped the economy grow. Ladies and gentlemen, The solution of side proposition would solve the situation faster, because it is always better to do something than nothing after all. Our solution would show people that while the economic crisis would reign, they will still have a way of living, and by slowly getting to the top, they would improve the situation as it was earlier. My teammate will tell you about the examples in real life and also broaden our arguments. Meanwhile, I want to tell you that you should vote for side proposition, hence heavily ease labor regulations in the times of the economic crisis. Thank you, and I am proud to